a dazzling New Year's Eve, a mysterious millionaire, and a love story full of surprises. Watch now to see how it all unfolds. Claire had a simple life rule: never mix business with personal favors. But as she stood in her tiny kitchen, clutching her phone like it might combust, she realized she might have to make an exception. "Claire, I'm begging you," her best friend Emily pleaded through the speaker. "You don't understand. This isn't just any client. It's the client. If I screw this up, my career is over. Done. All because I caught the flu from that little kid sneezing his lungs out in the bakery." Claire sighed, glancing at the takeout bags still sitting on the counter. She'd planned a quiet night of pad thai and rewatching a comfort movie, not stepping in to save Emily's event planning career. I don't know anything about fancy parties or elite clients. What if I say something stupid or trip on someone's $1,000 heels? You don't have to do anything. Just show up, look elegant, smile, and occasionally nod. If anyone asks about me, say I'm handling details behind the scenes." Claire frowned. Elegant wasn't exactly her wheelhouse. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of flannel shirts and leggings, with a fancy dress somewhere in the back of her closet that hadn't seen daylight in years. But Emily sounded desperate, and Claire had a weak spot for her best friend's crises. "Okay, fine," she relented, the word feeling like a step toward disaster. "I'll do it, but you owe me big time." "Claire, you're a lifesaver." Emily's voice cracked into a coughing fit, making Claire feel like an even worse person for almost saying no. "I've already arranged everything. Just pick up the dress at the boutique and head to the address I sent you. It's a small dinner party. Totally low pressure." Low pressure. Sure. 3 hours later, Claire stood in front of a mansion so enormous it could have been stolen from a Hollywood movie set. She tugged nervously at the silver dress Emily had chosen for her, trying to convince herself she belonged here. The butler, because of course there was a butler, opened the door with a curt nod. "Miss Harper?" Claire froze. That wasn't her name, but before she could correct him, he stepped aside. "Right this way, ma'am. The others are waiting in the drawing room." Others? Claire was supposed to stay in the background, keep a low profile, and leave unnoticed. But the man was already striding down a hallway that looked like the Louvre, so she followed, her heels echoing awkwardly against the marble floor. The drawing room was filled with people who looked like they belonged on the cover of Forbes or Vogue. Claire's heart pounded. Where was the small, discreet dinner party Emily had promised? "There you are," came a smooth voice from across the room. Claire turned, and her breath caught. The man walking toward her was tall, with dark hair and a face so striking it didn't seem fair to the rest of humanity. His tailored suit screamed power, and his intense gaze felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. "You're late," he said, his tone clipped. Claire started, but he cut her off. "No matter. We'll discuss it later. For now, let's get this over with." "Get what over with?" she managed to ask, her voice barely steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he took her hand, his grip firm but not unkind, and turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "Allow me to introduce my fiancé." "Fiancé?" Claire's brain short-circuited. She stared at the man, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This had to be a misunderstanding, or a joke. Or maybe she was dreaming, because surely she hadn't just been introduced as the fiancé of a man whose very presence could melt glaciers. The room erupted in polite applause. Elegant women in cocktail dresses and sharp-suited men raised their glasses, smiling as though they'd just witnessed the beginning of a fairy tale. Claire forced a smile, the kind she used when her boss asked her to work overtime for the 3rd weekend in a row. "Excuse me," she hissed under her breath, pulling her hand free. "What did you just call me?" The man arched a single brow, his expression as smooth as polished marble. "Keep your voice down." "You called me your fiancé," she whispered, her tone sharp. "That's not just a little misunderstanding." "I know exactly who you are," he replied coolly. "You're here to do your job, and right now, your job is to smile and act the part." Act the part? Claire's pulse raced. Who did this guy think he was? She barely knew his name, and even that only because Emily had mentioned him earlier. Ethan Stone, heir to the Stone family empire, CEO of something lucrative, and apparently the human embodiment of arrogance. "Look, Mr. Stone?" "Ethan," he interrupted. "Fine, Ethan." She folded her arms, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "There's been a mistake. I'm not your fiancé. I'm not even supposed to be here. I was covering for my friend Emily, who is my event planner," he finished for her. "And yes, I know, you're Claire Harper, her last-minute replacement." Her jaw dropped. "You knew?" "I suspected," he admitted, his tone maddeningly casual. "Emily's sudden absence was suspicious, and you're clearly not from this world." Claire bristled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing insulting." His gaze flicked over her, lingering just a moment too long. "You're different, fresh, honest. That's exactly why you'll do." "Do for what?" she demanded, her frustration mounting. Ethan leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandfather's will stipulates that I must be engaged by New Year's or lose my inheritance. Thanks to a series of unfortunate events, my actual fiancé left last week." "Actual fiancé?" Claire echoed, her eyes narrowing. "It was a business arrangement," he said, his tone dismissive. "But that's irrelevant now. What matters is that you're here, and everyone believes you're her." Claire stared at him, torn between outrage and disbelief. "You can't be serious. You want me to pretend to be your fiancé. For what exactly? A couple of hours?" "A week," he said calmly. She choked. "A week?" "Yes," Ethan replied, unflinching. "By the time the holidays are over, everything will be resolved. My inheritance will be secured, and you'll be compensated generously for your trouble." "Compensated?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I'm not some escort for hire." "Keep your voice down," he warned again, his tone icy. "This isn't a negotiation. If you walk out of here now, not only will it ruin me, but it will reflect very poorly on Emily's company, and I don't think she can afford that kind of hit." The words hit like a sucker punch. Emily had worked for years to build her event planning business, taking on impossible clients and sleepless nights to make her dream a reality. Claire couldn't let one misunderstanding destroy everything her friend had built. She exhaled shakily. "This is insane." Ethan's expression softened, just barely. "I'm not asking you to do anything unethical or dangerous. Just play the role. Smile, be charming, and when this is over, you can go back to your life." Claire hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but what choice did she have? She could endure a week of discomfort to help Emily, right? "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but I'm only doing this for Emily, and the second this is over, I'm gone." Ethan nodded, his lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Understood." But as she followed him back into the room, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil. Claire tried to calm her nerves as Ethan led her through the drawing room, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The room, with its gleaming chandeliers and soft hum of conversation, felt suffocating. The people were all smiles and polished surfaces, but their glances were sharp, calculating, as if they were cataloging her flaws. "Relax," Ethan murmured, his lips barely moving. "You look like you're about to bolt." "Gee, I wonder why," Claire whispered back. "This is definitely the strangest blind date I've ever been on." Ethan's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile threatening to break his otherwise stern demeanor. "If it helps, they already believe you're the one." "The one," Claire repeated under her breath. "You make it sound so romantic." Before Ethan could respond, a woman in a scarlet gown approached them, her smile dazzling but distinctly predatory. "Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with charm. "You didn't tell me your fiancé was so stunning." Claire's cheeks burned. She offered a polite smile, unsure of what to say. "Victoria," Ethan said smoothly, his tone neutral. "Allow me to introduce Claire Harper." He turned to Claire. "Victoria is an old family friend." "Old friend," Victoria echoed, her gaze sliding over Claire with a thinly veiled edge of disdain. "And where, may I ask, did Ethan find you, dear? You're quite the hidden gem." Claire swallowed hard, panic creeping in. We..." "Claire and I met through mutual acquaintances," Ethan interjected smoothly. "It was one of those rare moments where you just know." He glanced down at Claire, his eyes unusually soft as though he were actually fond of her. Claire blinked, caught off guard. He was good. Too good. Victoria's smile faltered just slightly before she recovered. "How lovely. Well, I look forward to getting to know you better, Claire. After all, marrying Ethan means marrying into the family." Claire's stomach flipped. Family? She hadn't signed up for this level of immersion. Ethan gave Victoria a tight smile. "Excuse us, we need to mingle." He steered Claire toward the far end of the room where the crowd was thinner. Once they were out of earshot, Claire leaned toward him. "Mutual acquaintances?" she whispered. "You couldn't come up with something more convincing?" "It worked, didn't it?" Ethan replied, not breaking stride. "Victoria will spend the rest of the night trying to figure out how I've kept you a secret. You'll be the talk of the evening." "Oh, joy," Claire muttered. Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His eyes, now serious, locked onto hers. "Listen, Claire, this isn't just about me. My family is complicated. There are people here who would love to see me fail, to take everything I've worked for. If you hesitate or break character, they'll pounce." "Great pep talk," Claire said dryly. "Really calming." "I'm serious." His tone softened, but his expression remained firm. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but if you trust me, just for tonight, we'll get through this." Claire inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "Fine, but I'm not calling you babe or darling or any of that nonsense." Ethan smirked. "Noted." The evening passed in a blur of introductions, forced smiles, and carefully rehearsed lines. Ethan handled every interaction with practiced ease, and Claire did her best to follow his lead. By the time they left the drawing room and retreated to the library, she felt like she'd run a marathon. "Do these people ever run out of things to say?" she groaned, sinking into a leather armchair. "They thrive on appearances," Ethan said, pouring 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter. "It's a game to them, one I've had to play my whole life." Claire accepted the glass he handed her, watching him carefully. For the first time he looked tired, the weight of the evening pressing down on his shoulders. "You don't seem like the type to play along," she said softly. Ethan sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I do what I have to, just like you're doing now." Claire sipped her wine, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "So what happens next?" she asked finally. Ethan leaned back, his gaze fixed on her. "We make it through the week, and if all goes well, by New Year's Eve you'll be free to go. And you'll have your inheritance." He nodded. "Must be nice," Claire said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, must be nice to have everything. Money, power, a mansion with its own butler, and still need someone like me to fix your problems." For a moment, Ethan looked like he might argue, but then he smiled, a small self-deprecating curve of his lips. "It's not as simple as it seems." "Nothing ever is," Claire replied. And for the first time that evening, they both fell silent, the space between them filled with something neither of them could quite name. The rest of the evening passed without further mishaps, though Claire felt like she'd aged a decade by the time Ethan's driver pulled up outside her apartment building. The sleek black car felt like an alien presence in her unassuming neighborhood, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Ethan opened the door for her, ever the gentleman, or maybe just careful to maintain appearances. "Thank you," she said stiffly, stepping out. She glanced up at him, his sharp silhouette backlit by the car's interior light. "So, what now?" "I'll call you in the morning," Ethan said, his tone all business. "We'll go over the rest of the week's itinerary." "Can't wait," Claire muttered, clutching her purse as she turned toward the building. "Claire," he called after her. She paused, glancing back. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thank you." Claire blinked, startled by the unexpected sincerity in his words. Before she could respond, he climbed back into the car and it glided away, leaving her alone on the sidewalk. Inside her small apartment, Claire kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. "What did I just get myself into?" she muttered. Her cat, Muffin, hopped onto her lap, purring loudly as if to say, "You're home, that's what matters." Claire stroked the cat absently, her mind racing. Ethan Stone. Handsome, rich, and infuriatingly composed. The kind of man she'd always avoided because she knew they lived in worlds so far apart, they might as well have been on different planets. And yet here she was, pretending to be his fiancé. She groaned, burying her face in her hands. The next morning, Claire's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ethan? I'll send a car at noon. Wear something warm? Warm?" She frowned, rereading the message. What kind of fiancé duties required warm clothing? At exactly noon, a black car arrived. "Claire, bundled in her coziest sweater and coat, climbed in, finding Ethan waiting for her. "You could have told me where we were going," she said as the car pulled away. "And ruin the surprise?" Ethan replied, his tone teasing. She shot him a look, but he only smirked. 30 minutes later, they arrived at a small outdoor skating rink nestled in a picturesque park. Claire blinked in surprise. "Skating?" she asked, stepping out of the car. "It's tradition," Ethan said, leading her toward the rental booth. "Every year, my family comes here the week before Christmas. My parents started it when I was a kid." Claire hesitated. This wasn't what she'd expected. For someone like Ethan, she'd imagined private jets and exclusive resorts, not a quaint public park. "You skate, right?" he asked, handing her a pair of rental skates. Sure," she lied. The truth was she hadn't skated since she was 12, but she wasn't about to admit that to Mr. Riade. Perfect. It took approximately 5 seconds on the ice for Claire to realize she'd made a mistake. Her legs wobbled as she clung to the railing, while Ethan glided effortlessly across the rink, as if he'd been born wearing skates. "You're doing great," he called, his voice laced with amusement. "I hate you," Claire muttered under her breath. He skated over, stopping gracefully in front of her. "Come on, let go of the railing." "Not a chance." Ethan extended his hand. "Trust me." Claire stared at his hand, then up at his face. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but something about the way he looked at her made her want to try. Tentatively, she released the railing and took his hand. "See? Not so bad," he said, guiding her slowly across the ice. "I'm one slip away from disaster," she grumbled, though his steady grip kept her upright. As they moved, something shifted. The cold air flushed her cheeks, and for a moment, she forgot about the charade. They laughed, genuinely laughed, when she stumbled but managed not to fall. For the first time, Ethan seemed less like the untouchable CEO and more like a regular person. By the time they left the rink, Claire's legs were sore, but her mood had lifted. "That wasn't so bad," she admitted as they walked back to the car. Ethan smiled, and it was different this time, softer, warmer. "I told you to trust me." For a fleeting moment, Claire wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ethan Stone than she'd thought. Over the next few days, Claire's life transformed into a whirlwind of designer outfits, rehearsed conversations, and carefully planned appearances. Ethan's world was equal parts glamour and pressure, and she was beginning to understand why he carried himself with such controlled precision. Still, there were moments when his polished exterior cracked, when he'd flash her a teasing smile or share an unexpectedly vulnerable story about his childhood. Those glimpses of the real Ethan unsettled Claire more than the charade itself. On Christmas Eve, Ethan invited her to the family estate. The mansion was breathtaking, a sprawling property nestled in the countryside, decorated with twinkling lights and lush garlands. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the sound of carols drifted from the grand piano in the living room. Claire stepped out of the car, clutching the borrowed clutch bag Ethan had insisted matched her dress. The dress itself, a deep emerald green, hugged her curves and made her feel like a character in a holiday movie. "You look perfect," Ethan said, his voice unusually soft as he joined her. Her cheeks flushed, but she brushed off the compliment. "Just playing the part, right?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on her. "Right," he said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. Inside, the Stone family was gathered in the grand dining hall. Ethan's parents, Richard and Margaret, exuded wealth and sophistication, their sharp eyes assessing Claire as if she were a rare artifact. His younger sister, Julia, was friendlier, pulling Claire aside to ask about everything from her favorite holiday traditions to how she and Ethan met. Claire repeated the story they'd agreed on, a chance encounter at a charity event, hoping she sounded convincing. Julia seemed satisfied, though Claire caught her glancing at Ethan with a knowing smile. After dinner, Ethan led Claire to the library, away from the prying eyes of his family. "You did well tonight," he said, pouring them each a glass of mulled wine. Claire sank into one of the plush chairs, kicking off her heels with a groan. "I feel like I'm on stage every second I'm here." "Welcome to my life," Ethan said with a wry smile. She studied him, her earlier frustration softening. "Is it always like this for you? The pressure? The expectations?" He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It's been this way since I was a kid, My grandfather built the company from nothing, and he expected perfection from all of us, especially me. Claire sipped her wine, her chest tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. That's a lot to carry. It is, Ethan admitted, but I've learned to manage it, or at least I thought I had. What do you mean? He hesitated, swirling the wine in his glass. This whole situation, it's made me realize how much I've been pretending, not just with my family, but with myself. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was the wine or the way he was looking at her, but the air between them felt charged, electric. Ethan? Before she could finish, he leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. Claire, I know this started as a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way it's felt like more. Her breath caught. Ethan, we're just pretending. Are we? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's heart raced as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For a moment, the world outside the library disappeared, leaving only the two of them. But before either of them could say anything more, the door creaked open, and Julia's head popped in. There you are, she said brightly, oblivious to the tension in the room. We're about to start the gift exchange. Come on! Ethan pulled back, his expression guarded once again. We'll be right there, he said. As Julia disappeared, Claire stood, smoothing her dress. We should go. Claire, not now, she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Ethan sighed, following her out of the room. Later that night, as Claire lay awake in the guest room, her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't ignore the way Ethan had looked at her, or the way it had made her feel. This wasn't supposed to happen, and yet it was getting harder to tell where the pretending ended and the real feelings began. Claire joined Ethan in the main living room, where the family had gathered around a massive Christmas tree that reached the ceiling. Beneath its glittering ornaments and golden ribbon was a sea of elegantly wrapped gifts, each one likely worth more than Claire's rent. She took a seat beside Ethan on the plush velvet couch, feeling out of place despite the warm fire crackling in the stone hearth. Ethan, ever composed, placed a reassuring hand on her knee, a gesture that felt too intimate given the turmoil churning in her chest after their moment in the library. This one's for you, Claire, Julia said, handing her a small box tied with a red ribbon. Claire blinked in surprise. For me? Of course. You're part of the family now, Julia said with a wink, making Claire's stomach tighten. She opened the box carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with tiny snowflake charms. It was stunning, understated, but undeniably expensive. It's beautiful, Claire said, genuinely touched. Thank you. I picked it out, Julia admitted. I figured you'd need a little sparkle to keep up with Ethan. Julia, Ethan said with a warning note in his voice, though he was smiling. What? It's true, Julia teased, earning a laugh from the others. As the gift exchange continued, Claire watched Ethan interact with his family. Despite his stoic nature, there was a softness in the way he spoke to his mother, a teasing edge when he joked with Julia. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a side that made her heart ache in ways she didn't fully understand. Later that night, after the gifts were unwrapped and the family had dispersed to their rooms, Claire found herself wandering through the quiet halls of the estate. She ended up in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with lush greenery and the soft scent of blooming flowers. The moonlight streamed through the glass, casting silvery shadows across the floor. You're up late, Ethan's voice said from behind her. Claire turned to find him leaning casually against the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair slightly tousled. He looked different like this, less polished, more human. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. He stepped into the room, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor. Neither could I. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves as a breeze swept through the conservatory. This place is incredible, Claire said, breaking the quiet. It's like something out of a fairy tale. It can feel that way, Ethan said, his tone wistful. But fairy tales have their dark sides too. Claire frowned, turning to face him. What do you mean? He hesitated, his gaze distant. Growing up here, there were expectations, rules. Everything had to be perfect, or it wasn't good enough. My grandfather made sure of that. Claire crossed her arms, leaning against a nearby pillar. Sounds exhausting. It was. He looked at her, his expression softening. That's why I envy you. She laughed, the sound bitter. Me? What's there to envy? You're real, he said simply. You don't pretend to be something you're not, and you're not afraid to call me out when I need it. Claire's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to remind him that she was pretending to be his fiancée, pretending to belong in his world. But the way he was looking at her made the words stick in her throat. Ethan. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire, I meant what I said earlier. This feels real. To me, at least. Her heart pounded as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, his gaze searching hers as if waiting for permission. And for a moment, Claire let herself forget about the lies, the deal, the ticking clock that loomed over them. She leaned in, her breath catching as his lips brushed hers, soft, hesitant, and utterly electrifying. The kiss deepened, and Claire felt herself melting into him, the world outside the conservatory fading away. But just as quickly as it had begun, reality came crashing back. She pulled away, her cheeks flushed and her mind racing. I can't do this, she said, her voice trembling. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. Claire, this isn't real, she said, taking a step back. We're not real. He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. Turning on her heel, she fled the conservatory, leaving Ethan standing alone in the moonlit room. Claire barely made it back to the guest room before the tears started. She wasn't even sure why she was crying. It wasn't as if she'd believed any of this was real. She'd known from the start that she and Ethan were pretending. And yet when he kissed her, she'd felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. That terrified her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. This is a job. That's all it is, she told herself. You're doing this for the money. For your future. Nothing more. But even as she repeated the words, they felt hollow. The next morning, Claire avoided Ethan. She stayed in her room until the last possible moment, then slipped downstairs for breakfast when she was sure most of the family had already left the table. Unfortunately, Ethan wasn't so easy to avoid. Claire, he called as she tried to make a beeline for the coffee pot. She froze, then turned to face him, plastering on what she hoped was a neutral expression. Good morning. Can we talk? Her stomach churned. I don't think that's a good idea. Claire, he said again, his tone firmer this time. She sighed, glancing around the empty dining room. Fine, talk. Ethan stepped closer, his expression serious. About last night, it was a mistake, she said quickly, cutting him off. He frowned. A mistake? Yes, she said, her voice rising slightly. This whole thing is a mistake. I don't belong here, Ethan. I'm not like you. That's not true, he said, his voice calm but insistent. You're exactly what I... What? She snapped, her frustration boiling over. What do you want from me, Ethan? Because if this is still about impressing your family or fulfilling some clause in a will, then I'm done. I can't keep pretending. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. It's not about the will anymore, Claire. It's about you. Us. There is no us, she said, her voice breaking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, suffocating. I see, Ethan said finally, his tone colder now. If that's how you feel, then maybe we should end this arrangement. Claire blinked, startled by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Ethan, I didn't mean... No, he said, cutting her off. You're right. This was a mistake. I'll make arrangements to send you home after the holiday. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dining room. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Claire felt like a ghost, floating through the motions of the holiday festivities without really being present. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed determined to avoid her. He was polite but distant, throwing himself into conversations with his family and barely acknowledging her presence. It hurt more than she wanted to admit. That night, as the Stone family gathered for one final holiday toast, Claire stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake, not just in agreeing to this arrangement, but in walking away from Ethan. Lost in thought? She turned to find Julia standing beside her, a glass of champagne in hand. Something like that, Claire said, forcing a smile. Julia studied her for a moment, then said, You know, Ethan's a good guy. He doesn't let many people in, but when he does, he's all in. Claire's heart ached at the words. I think I hurt him. Julia smiled gently. then maybe you should fix it. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Claire found herself standing outside Ethan's room, her heart pounding. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. What if he doesn't want to see me? Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Come in," came his voice from inside. Claire pushed the door open, finding Ethan sitting by the fireplace, a book in his lap. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, closing the book. "What are you doing here?" "I made a mistake," she said, stepping into the room. Ethan arched a brow. "Oh." She took another step closer, her pulse racing. "I was scared of how I felt, of what this might mean." "And what does it mean?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Claire hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But I want to find out, if you still want to." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, slowly, he stood and crossed the room to stand in front of her. "I do," he said, his voice soft but firm. Relief flooded through her, and when he reached out to pull her into his arms, she didn't resist. This time, when he kissed her, she didn't pull away. The next morning, the tension that had hung between Claire and Ethan for days seemed to melt away. They were careful not to be overly affectionate around his family, but every glance, every small touch, held a new sense of intimacy. As they prepared to leave the estate and return to the city, Ethan stopped Claire just as she was about to step into the car. "Wait," he said, taking her hand. She looked up at him, her breath visible in the frosty air. "What is it?" "There's something I need to say before we go back," he began, his tone serious. "I know this started as an arrangement, but I don't want it to end that way. I want more, Claire. I want us to be real." Claire's heart raced, a mixture of fear and exhilaration flooding her chest. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "Because this isn't just about you and me anymore. If we do this for real, your family, your world, it's all going to come into play." "I've never been more sure about anything," Ethan said, his gaze steady. "And as for my world, I want you in it, if you'll have me." She smiled, her fears easing as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "Then yes, let's make it real." Returning to the city felt like stepping into a different universe. The Stone family estate had been a cocoon of holiday magic, but now Claire and Ethan were back in the hustle and bustle of their everyday lives. For Claire, that meant figuring out what came next. Her temporary job at the bookstore was still waiting for her, but now that she had Ethan in her life, the thought of going back to her small apartment and paycheck-to-paycheck existence felt daunting. Ethan, meanwhile, had business to attend to. Meetings, phone calls, and boardroom negotiations consumed his days, leaving Claire to navigate her feelings and her future on her own. One evening, as Claire was reading in Ethan's apartment, she got a call from her friend Melanie, the one who had originally set her up for the dinner event. "So," Melanie began, her voice teasing, "how's life as a fake fiancé?" Claire hesitated. "About that, it's not fake anymore." Melanie squealed in delight. "Oh my God, I knew it. I knew you two had chemistry. So what's the next step? Engagement photos? A wedding date?" Claire laughed, though the thought of a real engagement sent a nervous flutter through her chest. "One step at a time, Mel." "Well, I expect to be maid of honor when the time comes," Melanie said firmly. Weeks passed, and Claire and Ethan settled into a rhythm. Their relationship was still new, but it felt natural, like they'd known each other far longer than they actually had. One snowy evening, Ethan invited Claire to dinner at a cozy restaurant overlooking the city. She didn't think much of it until he led her to a private balcony adorned with fairy lights and candles. "Ethan," she said, glancing around. "What's all this?" He smiled, taking her hands in his. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Before she could process what was happening, he dropped to one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Claire," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I never expected you to walk into my life the way you did, but now I can't imagine it without you. You've shown me what it means to be real, to love without pretense, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears filled Claire's eyes as he opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into his arms. As they kissed, the city lights sparkled around them, and Claire felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was exactly where she belonged. Months later, Claire and Ethan were married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Melanie, true to her word, served as maid of honor, while Julia took on the role of chief mischief maker, ensuring that no moment of the day was too serious. As Claire and Ethan danced beneath a canopy of stars, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. What had started as a pretend engagement had turned into the kind of love she'd only ever read about in books, and as Ethan whispered in her ear, promising her forever, Claire knew that their story was just beginning.